Thanks, Krish. Joining me now is Dr. Robert Cadigan, Professor of Criminal Justice here at Boston University. Thank you so much for coming onto our show.
Very welcome.
All right, so let's start with a big picture question. Do certain areas of the globe receive more coverage than others in terms of terrorism overseas?
Yes, very definitely. I think that we are drawn towards stories that focus on Europe much more so than on Asia or Africa. I think that in part this is a function that Americans, we're familiar with Europe. Many of us have been there. We understand the context of bombings. We understand what it's like to be in a cafe or in an airport. I think that we can see ourselves in the situation of the victims, and we see ourselves in a common world situation. I think it's much more difficult to understand the complex politics, say, in some of the Asian and African countries where we hear of terrorist events, such as the situation in Thailand last year or the situation of the Uyghurs in China. We have much greater difficulty understanding the context in which those events are occurring. We also have less access to the situation on the ground to understand what the situation looked like before the scene, so that we see the after effects, but we don't really understand the context or the culture.
Do you think that race plays a part in this unequal coverage of terrorism?
I think that race and culture do play a part. I think that if we look at the situation with, say, British broadcasting, the British newspapers, television, they do a much better job of covering Africa and Asia than we do in the United States. And that, I think, relates back to the fact that many of the countries are part of the British Commonwealth. The BBC has a long tradition of international reporting, and they have a greater familiarity with the cultures and the political issues than we do.
So there are differences in terrorism and its coverage. How do these differences shape the way that we think and perceive global terrorism?
Well, I think that we tend to look primarily at Islamic jihadist terrorism. That is the dominant form of terrorism that concerns us. We are perhaps less concerned with domestic violent extremism, though that is a significant issue. And as reports have noted, there have been more Americans killed by violent domestic extremists than by jihadists in the United States since 9/11.
Are we seeing a prominence in this portrayal of terrorism in the media, especially online, because of increased audience interest?
I think that there is a significant audience interest, especially as we look at, again, we see a concern that some people consider an existential threat to the United States. While the likelihood that any one individual is going to be affected by terrorism, we can all see ourselves in situations of people that are affected by terrorism.
Do you believe that the media is enabling terrorists by providing them so much coverage?
Well, I think that the media has generally tried to be responsible with balancing the messages of terrorists with explanations from experts and putting a context around the terrorists' explanations themselves by not providing the material, such as the most violent material, the beheadings and such, that we might see. I think that from the perspective of the terrorists, it could be said that terrorists crave publicity, and any publicity can be good from that perspective, and that's always a problem with balancing a free press with our needs for security.
So in addition to the news media, are terrorists enabled by the use of social media in order to spread their message?
I think even more so than the mainstream media. And what we see online right now is a number of jihadist sites that are available, a number of white supremacist sites that are spreading the message quite effectively and targeted to a particular audience that's receptive. And that's a key point. It's to a receptive audience, where people can create a relationship with the person on the other end of the computer.
Transitioning to government in America, do politicians capitalize on terror events to push their own policy positions?
I think what we see is generally, we've seen a couple of different perspectives. After 9/11, up through 2010 or so, it was the global war on terror perspective that emphasized the fact that we were not at war with Islam, that there were particular groups that were potentially threatening to the American way of life, and that we needed a transnational response. That has evolved somewhat I don't think the term has crept into the American consciousness yet, but the idea of countering violent extremism, that it's not a global war so much as we have responsibilities to identify and deal with the process through which people are radicalized and then move on to violent extremism. The other side of that is the clash of civilizations perspective, and we're seeing a lot of that in this election cycle, with people sort of identifying 1.5 billion people as potential enemies, as seeing the religion of Islam as a global threat.
All right, so our final question is, what is the best way for the media to cover global terrorism?
I wish I had a good answer to that one, but I think that one of the things that's most important is that the media keep things in perspective and to make sure that they are not giving the terrorists a free ride with propaganda videos. I think it's important that people have the facts to know where they might be unsafe at particular times. But I also think it's important that the media not create a moral panic around these issues in terms of exaggerating the likelihood of attacks.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Very welcome.
That does it for this episode of On That Point. I'd like to thank my co-host, Krish Arora, On That Street reporter, Emily Page, and our guests, Chief Thomas Robbins, Professor Greg Marinovich, and Dr. Robert Cadigan. Make sure to follow us on Twitter @OnThatPoint and like us on Facebook. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.